the monkey man. Very much the archetype of a dive tank in Overwatch. So there's basically three types of tanks in Overwatch. There's obviously like the main tank off tank dynamic, but there's sort of two general types of main tanks. There's the dive tanks like Winston and Wrecking Ball, and there's the more like the anchor tanks of Reinhardt and Orisa and those kind of people.
Yep.
And then everyone else kind of falls in the sort of amorphous category of off tank that plays more of a supporting role than a main tanking role.
Okay.
So in your mind, just as a quick question, what sort of defines a main tank? What's the common similarity between Winston and Reinhardt, between Wrecking Ball and Orisa? Even though they're very different heroes, what's the common thing that they do as main tanks?
It's the space they take. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Really, the main thing actually is just the space they take, but they all take it kind of in a different way for it.
Yeah, of course.
And then controlling space is like the second part, but I feel like off tanks do that more efficiently than the main tanks. Yeah,
absolutely. So big things, obviously space, and I'm going to add one thing onto that, and I'm going to call it attention. Basically, you can think of attention basically anytime you're taking fire, anytime someone is looking at you, or even just thinking about you. These are things that are going to limit the amount of time that you have to spend in that space. So basically, anytime you go in, anytime you walk into the enemy's crosshairs, you're starting a fuse. And eventually that fuse is going to run out. As Ryan, your shield's going to break. You're going to have to back up. As Winston, you're going to run out of bubble. You're going to have to jump out, stuff like that. There's plenty of things in the game that lengthen that fuse. If you have a diva matrixing you, if you get bubbled by Zarya, if you get healed or lamped by a Baptiste, these things extend how long you can stay in that space. But it's good to remember that anytime you commit anywhere as a main tank, anytime you exist on the map, understand that you're existing there with a timer. So understanding that anytime you walk into space, anytime you walk into the enemy sightlines, anytime you're seen by the enemy, basically, you're on a timer. And making sure that when those moments happen, you're doing them with explicit purpose, and you have sort of plans around your movements, around your targets, around your engages, and stuff like that.
Yeah, so
we'll get all that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the timer. So when you say like a timer, does that necessarily mean when I have to like eventually retreat or move forward? But timer, just I'm not going to be in that same spot for very long. Yeah,
so basically, as an individual, at an individual level, you can think of this as like, how long is your health bar going to last? How long until your jump cooldown is back? How long is your bubble going to last? And stuff like that. At the end of the day, that all matters. It's obviously, if you have primal, you can extend it yourself basically for free. That's one of the best uses for that ultimate, is just extending your engage potential and stuff like that, stalling out the fight a little bit longer so your team has more time to work with.
Gotcha.
And yeah, so basically the biggest things you're thinking about as a main tank, regardless of whatever main tank you're playing, is what space you're fighting for and how long you have to fight for it.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we'll talk more about that when we get to sort of playstyle, but first thing I like to do is just to walk through all the cooldowns, mechanics, and stuff like that go along with Winston. Like I said, being a tank hero, he doesn't have any crazy outplay, huge mechanical tech or anything like that, but he's still worth talking about. So getting his gun out of the way. Obviously, very good AoE cleave damage, but not really a burst potential there. This is not a thing that you're typically going into a fight expecting to get a lot of kills with, unless you're cleaning up like an already finished team fight and things like this. Primarily, your primary fire as Winston should just be to hit as many targets as possible, as often as possible, to get the most damage, obviously, but also to build your primal as quickly as possible. There's a lot of situations where, especially on defensive holds, you're just thinking about, oh, they're coming this way, I'm going to get so many zaps in. Oh, I'm going to zap them when they're rotating here. I'm going to zap them when they cross this choke. All these kind of things. You're just setting up for big zaps. Yes, you will find kills. Yes, if you're running like a dive comp with Diva, Tracer, you'll end up finishing kills for them and stuff like that. But don't think of it as like, I'm going in to kill people. Think of it as I'm going to zap as many people as possible, to annoy as many people as possible, to tickle them with my Tesla cannon for as long as possible, basically.
Okay, so the cleave damage that you're getting from, so like maintaining high ground or something to like try to get above them, or just do whatever I can to engage to get that ult built and then getting out.
Exactly.
Not really going in for the picks or anything. Getting that attention.
Yeah, if you're going for picks, it should be because of a very strong reason. Either because like someone is completely out of position and they're just feeding and something like that, or because you're already so ahead in the fight that you can get away with more aggressive movement and stuff like that.
Okay.
Like you said about being above, your target. I don't think there's many great examples in the training range, but obviously your Tesla cannon goes vertically as well as horizontally. It's almost like a sphere coming out the front of your gun. So you can do stuff like from above targets. Obviously, you know when you're landing on someone, you zap down on them. And stuff like that. I could even like hit a target from here. So the range is decent. I think it's about 8 meters. Something like that. Whatever in-game meters actually look like, who knows. But obviously, playing a Winston player, I'm sure you know the range. And as long as you're getting those big hit markers and getting that ult charge, you'll be golden. Not too much to talk about when it comes to Tesla Cannon. Obviously, making sure you're at full ammo anytime you go in aggressively, anytime the enemy team is walking through your zaps, stuff like that is important. But the only other thing I'll mention is that if you are in a 1v1 situation,
the melee.
Tesla Cannon weaving in melees is exactly the same damage per second, but is actually beneficial in 2 ways. Obviously, it saves you ammo, and it actually does more burst damage. This will mean it does more damage against armor, and it finds kills faster. So if you get someone down to like a single bar, like this tracer here, then the melee finishes them off faster than the Tesla Cannon would. But you know all that. Those are just basic things.
Okay. Yeah. I've got that little habit in my when I want to be one.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Yep.
Basically, yeah. If you're trying to finish the target, always melee them. If you are 1v1ing someone, just melee as often as possible.
Okay.
And yeah, until Overwatch 2, there's not really much else to talk about when it comes to his gun. Maybe in the future you can look forward to having a little bit of a rail gun, and having some range damage.
Very excited
but
about
for
that,
now, that's all you get to work with, unfortunately.
Okay. And then I guess you're. I was gonna say like the different techs with Winston, but this isn't really what Tate's got. It was just the rocket jump melee that everyone always talks about in all their videos. But yeah, all right.
So yeah, let's talk about rocket jump. Obviously, decent mobility tool, relatively short cooldown, not as quick as Diva boosters, but almost. It's about 6 seconds from the moment you touch the button. So you start your cooldown as you're flying through the air. This is good to remember if you're expecting to do soft dives and be ready to jump out right away. Sometimes you want to stall yourself in the air a bit longer and make sure you know exactly where you're landing. That's the most important part of using your jump, knowing exactly where you're going to land and why. Are you landing on a high ground because you're trying to take space and soft dive and work through the map? Are you landing directly on top of an opponent so you can get the landing damage and continue bursting them down? Are you landing behind an opponent? Oops, or off the map like that.
Wait, you did get behind them. Yeah.
True. Yeah, are you landing directly behind an opponent so you can bubble off their backline so they can't get healed or things like that? There's lots of reasons to be wherever you want to be all over the map. Just understand that the moment you hit shift, you need to know where you're planning to land. It's the same thing if you're playing Diva and you're launching a bomb. You don't just throw it up in the air. You want it to explode at a very specific location for specific reasons. So same thing with monkey jump. You want your body to be in a specific location for specific reasons. Obvious ones are directly landing on a target. Target you're trying to dive, target you're trying to kill. This is going to be your easiest setup for dive engages. This is also, unfortunately, the sort of shallowest dive engage. And what I mean by that is that it has the least potential to continue being aggressive. So when you dive directly on a target, you'll start zapping them, you melee them when you land, you put down your bubble, but after that point, by the time your next jump is up, you're likely out of resource and are going to be forced to jump back. Compare that to 2 slightly different situations. Let's compare that to, and I know we're in the training range, this is like a terrible example of a map, but say we're doing a soft dive where instead of jumping directly on them, I jump up here to zap them, I get some bit of zaps in, but I don't take as much damage myself. Maybe I'm not even forced to bubble, and then my next jump I can jump deeper depending on what my team did with that soft dive, or I can still jump out. And then the most aggressive option. So we've got sort of like the default option, a more passive option of soft diving and taking a bit of a safer space, and then a more aggressive option of deep diving. And this is going to be sort of like that behind landing thing where, here, let's see if I can find a better example of a bot.
Okay.
They're all up against walls here. It's annoying. So let's say this bot's walking up here, walking up these stairs here, and then his team's walking up behind him. This is like a Reinhardt. I'd want to jump right behind him as he's at the top of these stairs, body block him, zap him from behind, and put my bubble down, not to block damage, but to isolate the target in front of me. And stuff like that. So positioning. Shift is just your shortcut to a better position, but position needs a strong decision behind it. You need to know exactly what you're going for and why, and again, how long you're able to do that for realistically.
That makes sense.
Make sense?
Yeah. So like with trying to be better at specific types of jumps. Is there what's the best way to get better like mechanically with my rocket jumps? Because I mean, there's like the bag like rocket jump, you know, then there's the rocket jump with bag to like make it shorter, or to like get behind the line to split off the team. And so I just want to get more accurate with it too. So like hit my windows and everything perfectly. Is it just like right now I just go to custom game and pick a map and I just set his jump to no cooldown? Is that the best way, or is there like a specific workshop or anything that you know of to get better at that?
Yeah, ultimately it's trial and error. Going into like a custom game and getting used to the mechanics and like jumping around and how like your airspeed changes when you hold different directional keys and things like that. Really, really good to get comfortable on it. But what's honestly most important is not having really good map knowledge. It's being able to read the terrain in front of you and being able to adapt a jump to that situation. So yes, eventually with enough hundreds of hours in Overwatch, you'll have set jumps on specific spots and set holding locations on specific maps. Like I'm sure you've seen Winston's holding on like weird ledges just to get zaps and chokes and things like that. So you will learn those things almost passively, either by watching people or by finding them yourself accidentally, or by watching Winston guides on YouTube and watching like the 101 Winston spots for Oasis or whatever it is.
I know, yeah,
and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Ultimately though, my opinion is that the most important thing is not all the tricks that you can do basically, but having a fundamental understanding and being able to use it for the core aspects of it. So yes, those tricks are nice and might lead to some POG ranked plays and stuff like that, but ultimately it's not the core part of your gameplay, and the core part is looking for those strong engages. So again, those 3 types of dives are going to be our focus point for this review.
Okay.
Again, those are just like landing directly on a target for the most burst damage, landing in front of the target for a softer dive, maybe on an off angle for safety, and then diving past the target for a more aggressive dive and for more isolation, and that's with a more expected engage potential.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, talking a little bit about the mechanics of the jump. Obviously, there's the damage when you land on a target. Combining that with zaps as you're falling on them and a melee the second you land is your biggest burst damage in the game outside of the primal. So good to always have that tech down. It's not complicated. You basically just zap them when you see them, melee them when you're in range, and then land on top of them. It's small, but worth noting that your jump actually does a bit of damage as it takes off as well, which you'll notice by getting hit markers right beside someone. Yeah, it does, I think, 5 damage. It's literally nothing, but it is worth noting if you're like in the middle of a big team fight that jumping up and then landing straight down, especially like during a primal, for example, can be beneficial. So like if you're juggling a target or you're dueling a target and you're out of bubble, so you need to drop some aggro, jumping straight up will cause a bit of AoE damage around you, and then doing more obviously when you land on top of them. Small stuff, not really that important, but
I didn't know that though. Yeah, but that's helpful. Like if they're all bunched up together, jumping up.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it actually matter, but I mean, free damage, free ult charge, why not? You know, a little bit of extra ult charge in the bank never hurts. And then finally,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna move on to talking about his bubble. What were you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna say like sometimes what I'm doing with an Ana, if we're like in a big team fight and it's lasting forever, they'll like literally just be like just jump straight up and then they just
and you get the nano and then you're back in.
So I get like a little extra ult charge with that jump if they're all on the payload or something. So yeah, that's good to know. That's fair.
And then obviously, actually before jumping onto bubble, it does the disruption as well. So you can get environmental kills with this as well if they're close enough to the ledge. It's not consistent. It's not a huge boop. It's not even like a Lucio boop or a Brig bash, or not bash, a whip shot or things like that. But it is something, and if they're holding the wrong key, it's worth noting. Again, this is mainly something you're going to abuse when landing behind a target to boop them slightly more into your team. He turned around at the perfect frame there, so he juked me, but landing behind someone, booping them a little bit forward just like that.
Further isolate them and put them with your team.
Exactly. Really, really useful at corners, at chokes, and typically you're going to be doing this against like enemy main tanks that are just walking into a fight, stuff like that. But also really good for if there's like a soldier on the high ground flanking, you just jump right behind him. Maybe you boop him away from the choke he came out of, and then you body block him so he can't escape. Little niche
I actually don't think about that when I'm trying to get the high ground. Jumping behind him, like force him off.
Just to hold his escape route, and then he's either forced to try and duel you and walk through you, or he's forced to take a really awkward escape path and stuff like that. Think like King's Row first point. If there's someone on the top right high ground there in that clock tower, and then you just jump to the choke so they can't escape, all of a sudden they're forced to run down the stairs to the mega, and they're completely separated from their team. Maybe.
Yeah.
Best case scenario, at least.
Yeah.
All right, and then last part of our base kit before we get to our ultimate is the bubble. This is for the most part, an individual utility cooldown. This is something you should be thinking about yourself before anyone else when you're using it. If you are forced to bubble for someone else, that extremely gimps your playstyle as Winston, because I'm sure you've heard all the like the shield dance tech, the blocking tech, and like isolation tech with bubbles. It's a very flexible cooldown, but it doesn't last very long. So again, it's really good for creating and holding that space, but that timer is still relatively short.
Yeah.
Combining this with your mobility, your tank HP pool, and the way you position yourself mid-fight, these are all the tools you're going to use to extend your duration. So when you're jumping in, you're starting the fuse burning. You start zapping, maybe they force to fall back, maybe they hold their ground, they start fighting you. Either way, you're likely going to be forced to bubble, and then depending on how long your bubble lasts and how good you are at shield dancing, this extends your fight timer until basically it's gone, and then you're maybe either forced to jump out, or maybe we got a kill or two and we can keep going forward. Stuff like that. This is your safety net whenever you go in. If you have a D.Va on your team, if you have a Zarya on your team, you've got additional safety nets, of course, but in a ranked environment especially, we can't always depend on those, so always make sure when you are planning an aggressive move, you know exactly how long your timer is. You don't always need bubble, but understand that if you don't have bubble, you're much, much more limited.
Yeah.
And you're probably going to do more soft dives, safer angles, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, some cool tech with the bubble. Obviously, it's 700 HP. It's 100 HP higher than Orisa's shield for whatever reason. And it blocks LOS really efficiently. So there are certain ultimates and abilities in the game that require LOS that seem a little bit unintuitive. So for example, Blizzard is probably the most obvious example where, actually the most obvious example is probably like D.Va Bomb. The D.Va Bomb flying into your middle of your team, you can bubble it, and then obviously anyone outside of the bubble, assuming the bomb's inside, won't get hurt by it. It'll break your bubble, sure, but it'll block everyone from the lethal damage because it all comes out at once.
Yeah.
It also blocks ticks of blizzard. So if there's a blizzard in the middle of your team and you bubble it and you get out, it'll block that. It also blocks things like transcendence that requires LOS, or sound barrier as it's casting. So being able to block off those abilities offensively is also really strong utility value of your bubble.
So
this is where we start.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
All right, let's go.
No, sorry. I rant all the time. You're good.
Okay. So back to the Blizzard one though. Like when I'm trying to LOS it, say. So, does the center of the Blizzard have to be inside the bubble, or how does the LOS work specifically?
So it's exactly like Transcendence, where it starts at its center and then pushes outward. So if it's around a corner, so say I'm the Blizzard as the monkey here, and I'm blizzarding from right here, you'd be frozen there, but around this corner, you wouldn't feel anything. And you could like dip in and out of that and sort of never get frozen, even if you take a few ticks. Okay. So if you treat this pillar as your bubble instead, if I'm standing here as the Blizzard and the bubble's right around me, everyone outside the bubble is safe. Or vice versa. If it's outside the bubble, everyone that's inside the bubble is safe from future ticks.
That's
stuff like that.
To know. Yeah. So, and because you can still see Blizzard like out here. When it's getting
right, exactly.
Yeah, it still shows
You'll
up,
still see it on the ground,
frozen.
which is confusing. For sure.
I
Maybe they'll change that for Overwatch too.
Yeah, hopefully.
But yeah, like even if I throw Blizzard like in here as Mei, you'll still see like the floor pattern over here, and it might get confusing for sure. So it's always good to remember where the source of the ability is coming from.
was working. Okay, gotcha.
For sure. And then the other thing you can use it offensively is primarily for things like enemy support ultimates like Sound Barrier or Transcendence. You can actually stop Transcendence from healing teammates if they're not on the same side of the bubble. And you can do some really cool things like we've seen in the Overwatch League, where, for example, the enemy team gets grabbed and the Zenyatta's stuck on one side of the grab, and then you sort of bubble halfway through, and the grab's like right in the middle here, and half the team's getting Transcendence, the other half isn't, and you can usually burn down 1 or 2 targets. I wouldn't say aim for that, but just understand that it is possible, and you can try to react to certain things. For the most part, in a ranked environment, no one is going to even notice you bubbling a Transcendence, so don't do it to like expect huge kills and stuff like that. But maybe if you're fighting in a grab anyway, there's kind of like no reason not to throw down the bubble there to potentially block Transcendence healing. But if you're like solo killing someone and you're getting soloed by Mei, don't think like bubbling the Blizzard is going to save you, because she'll just run you down anyway.
Okay.
It's not huge tech, and again, because you are a main tank, a lot of this stuff doesn't fall on you individually. It's how you set the stage for the rest of your team in a lot of these situations.
Yeah, gotcha.
And then, of course, there's the normal stuff, blocking damage, blocking healing, blocking shatters, and stuff like that that you can do with bubbles, but I'm sure you already knew all that.
Yeah.
The only other interesting thing, I suppose, would be to note that it is a sphere, obviously, so when you see it on the high ground, it's a full-on bubble. You can block things below you as well as above you, depending on the situation. This is really useful on maps like, for example, Anubis First Point on that bridge for defenders. If you're able to put a bubble up there, it'll block not only the high ground, but also people on the low ground trying to shoot through that
try to go underneath it, yeah.
entrance. Yeah. So
Interesting.
few niche situations where that will be important, but it's not a huge knowledge
Yeah, I was going
bank
to
or
ask
anything
like
that.
how big of a difference is it when you get like bubbles like that where it's blocking down below and above it?
It usually depends on what kind of threats you're looking to block. So honestly, outside of that one instance on Anubis First Point, I'm struggling to come up with like good areas of maps where it might actually make a difference.
Gotcha.
The biggest thing when you're using your bubble is mainly just understanding how it's extending your own personal timeline, and then how you might be affecting other members, typically DPS members of your team. We'll get a bit more into that with playstyle stuff, but for example, in a dive composition, you're bubbling for yourself, of course, because you're a key part of dive, but also people like a Genji or a Tracer might use that bubble to find a favorable duel during the fight, or to avoid extra damage and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, I think that's all that we have to talk about with bubble. Let's start talking about primal. So, primal is a bit of a controversial ultimate. It's arguably one of the best ultimates in the game, but also has one of the highest mechanical requirements on a typically non-mechanically demanding hero.
Yeah.
So it is a bit of a yeah, it's a bit of an awkward spot. So I want pop quiz time, I guess. What is your favorite way to use primal? Like, what's the situation you see yourself using primal most often? What's the situation you find yourself most comfortably using primal right now?
So two main ones, or three main ones would be. First one is just extending the life of Monkey.
Yeah, if you're gonna die, Q means you don't die.
Hard, yeah, and so waiting until I get pretty low in health and then using Monkey. Second one is engaging to kind of like get the tempo for the team. So then using the backline to allow my team to just bum rush them, especially if like more dive comp with like Doomfist or Genji. Then the third one is like defensively. So if Genji's nanoblading and we don't have like a hard stop counter for him, then I'll try to use primal to try and just keep him from being able to get to my backline or whatever he's trying to do, or soldier visor or some.
Yeah, if there's something
like that.
All right, awesome. So I'm gonna classify these as three ultimates. So we got panic ults, basically to extend our duration, to live a bit longer. This can be planned, of course, but this is something that happens all the time in every game of Overwatch, where you're expecting to find value without having a primal, but then suddenly you get anti-nated or something happens, you get slept or flashbang, then you're forced to primal a bit early, and it just extends your duration. This is typically something that's going to go unplanned, but is a good get-out-of-jail-free card when necessary. The other two, I want to focus more on the planning around them. So that engaged one, that's basically a little bit like of the first two ones you told me about, are basically the same in similar ways, where you're either like going in and then primaling to extend, or you're going in with the intention to primal early and looking for that early disruption to start the fight. Both of those lead to disruption-based engages, but one of them has a little bit more planning around it, which is like sort of the second one you told me. So we'll talk about like the panic ults, which happen all the time, but then also the planned engagement ults for disruption. And there's typically two ways you're going to plan for disruption when going in aggressively with primal. So one is obviously knowing that you have a much longer fuse to burn, right? You've doubled your HP. I mean, effectively tripled if you use enough of your base HP before that. And you become this unkillable beast in the enemy backline. And you can typically look for one of two goals. Either you're looking to just completely spread the enemy team so that they can't use their resources for each other. Their healers can't heal their tanks. Their DPS can't focus the same target. All that good stuff. During that time, you'll likely try to isolate a single target from the rest of their team. For example, a main tank like a Reinhardt, booping him into your team and then going to boop his supports around means that Reinhardt's probably going to die, even without you furthering follow up on him. The other way is if you start juggling or looking to environmental kill specific targets. Like, say, you see a Zen Brig crossing a bridge on Lijiang Gardens, and you think, hey, I can land right on top of them, boop them both right off, my team doesn't even need to do anything, and then I'll jump back into them and we can clean up the team fight. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Or if you see someone like in the middle of a building, like in here with these bots, you can just juggle them into a corner, something easy, and then burst them down solo, stuff like that. Those are our two main types of engage ultimates, and again, just like our jumps, we should be knowing exactly what we're going for the moment we jump in for the first time, and then of course the moment we hit Q once we're
coming
in.
out. Okay. Oh, once you're in, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, so one of those two ways for looking aggressively, those are most common. And then of course, like you said, for defensive ultimates, and this is what I'll call a tempo ultimate. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
A tempo ultimate. I think is that just being basically putting the enemy on their back foot and our teams be able to be the aggressor? Yeah. Okay.
This is gonna sound like really maybe unrealistic, but you could almost think of Overwatch as like this turn-based strategy game where the enemy team is using their ultimates and pushing in, we survive, then we use all our ultimates and push back and stuff like that. That's like the basic ebb and flow of Overwatch. Obviously, it's not that simple in game. Things go wrong all the time. Things find value, things don't. People find picks, ultimates don't land, whatever happens. It's a much more chaotic environment than a chess game, for example.
Right.
But tempo, in my opinion, there's so many different definitions for tempo in Overwatch these days. But my definition is basically, if tempo is swinging in your favor, it typically means that your team is at advantage and you want to play faster. You want to play a higher tempo. If the tempo is at disadvantage or in the enemy's favor, that means you're probably used cooldowns, you've been taking damage, you have less potential to go aggressive, and you want to play slower, to absorb more, wait for your cooldowns to come back, get healed up, whatever it is, and then go in once you're at full strength.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
When I say tempo ultimate, it's an ultimate that, because it's not a base ability, it's not something that can always be planned around. It's almost like the surprise X factor move that you can pull out, your limit break, or whatever you want to call it, where all of a sudden the enemy's read on what the fight was looking like suddenly gets tipped further in your scale. And that's going to either look like a fight that's sort of going back and forth and sort of in neutral where neither team has an advantage to suddenly you have an advantage, or it's going to look like the enemy team's starting to push on an advantage, but the team to fight's not decided yet, like we're still able to absorb some of it. Maybe they just tack visored, like you said, or they nanobladed. Just because they nanobladed, yes, they have huge potential, but until he actually gets the kills, it's still not really in their advantage yet, so we can swing the tempo back to neutral or maybe even slightly in our favor by primaling in that moment. Trading primal for a nano blade, a nano tack visor, you're not going to get much value, but you're going to stop them from getting all that planned value and swing tempo into your team's favor.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, so it's essentially something that the enemy team cannot ignore, or it has to do some, like, make some kind of reaction to for it to have it. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this big surprise reveal, basically.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all the plans they had leading up to that moment, assuming you play well with the primal, you actually get on your target. You don't just jump off the map like I did earlier.
Yeah.
You actually just completely take the wind out of their sails, and then because of how long primal lasts as well, you have the potential to push into them and then actually turn it from their fight advantage back to neutral to then into your favor.
Okay.
It's kind of like this pendulum swing that goes back and forth, but you can leave it on the enemy's side for a little bit longer when you use these abilities.
Yeah. So then, for the actual, when I'm actually primaling and going in with a plan, what should my thought process be? And like, just whenever, both for like mostly engaging, really, that's the biggest one, is because he's a completely different character when he's ulting than when I'm playing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So what should I be like trying to go through in my process when I'm doing that?
So you should think of it almost like a normal engage. You should still have a target, a position you're going to land, and understand your team's follow-up potential all before you even hit your initial jump, before you jump into the enemy team for the first time. So understanding you have primal but haven't used it yet to actualize its potential means, for the most part, you have a much longer individual timer, like we've been talking about. You can extend your own fuse, but until you actually execute your plan, that doesn't matter to the rest of your team, realistically. The best you're going to be doing for them is just taking a bunch of attention, not necessarily always opening up the fight for them. So just like anything else for dive engages, we're looking for timing, making sure that our team can capitalize on it. And again, we're setting the stage for a team more than we're trying to 1v6 the enemy team with primal.
Right,
And we are waiting for key moments where we're making sure that any attention we do take, during the time our fuse is being burnt down, the rest of our team is capitalizing on that. We've got hit scan walking in, we got flankers following up, we got our off tank supporting you, all these kind of things.
Okay.
The second thing, obviously, knowing the stage you're walking into, the stage you're trying to set, by far the most important thing is going to be your target. And whether or not it's a target you're directly affecting or indirectly affecting doesn't matter. So like that situation I said before, if you're looking to kill a Rhine, that doesn't mean you need to juggle a Rhine into a wall. Honestly, that'll probably get you killed before the enemy Rhine if he just pins you or something like that.
Yeah.
But what you can do is jump behind the Rhine, boop him once into your team, and then disrupt his backline. So he's got no healing, he's got no damage follow-up, and it's just that much easier for your team to burn down the Rhine.
Okay.
The other way, if you are directly influencing your target, like you're juggling people or you're looking for environmental kills, then that's relatively simple. It's just about mechanics at that point.
Yeah. This helps a lot. Yeah, my problems are just a lot more chaotic right now.
Yeah, for sure.
So knowing like process like that, yeah, that helps.
So yeah, those panic ults I mentioned before, there's no shame in using those. Just so you know, like extending your fuse is necessary often. Like, how many times have you seen Echoes just panic duplicate an Ana in the enemy backline just because they were afraid of dying, right? Like it happens. Yeah, exactly. It happens all the time. So don't be afraid to commit primal in those instances. Much better for the most part, unless you're like actually 1v6ing. It's usually a lot better to stay alive and risk wasting your ultimate than it is to just die in that moment and try to wait for the perfect ultimate available.
Exactly. Okay. Cool.
All right, awesome. So let's talk about a little bit of core gameplay loop for Winston. So first question, what is your favorite, let's say like, what's your favorite off tank to play with as Winston, and what's your favorite like example DPS line to play with as Winston?
Favorite off tank to play with as Winston? Definitely Zarya, just because it extends my life and eats some of my I'll eat some of the CC if I jump in. So running in, then and getting as much cleave damage as possible through there. Then the favorite DPS to play with, right now Genji. Genji is like probably my favorite one, and then maybe Doom after with that as well.
Okay.
Not my best ones, but my favorite ones for sure.
No, yeah, fair enough. There's a very key commonality between all three of those heroes that you mentioned. Any chance you might have a hint of what that is?
Well, they're all dive and high burst.
High burst, exactly what I was looking for. High burst and very reliant on specific cooldowns. Genji around dash, Doom around, all of his cooldowns, and Zarya around bubbles, right? These are very key cooldowns, and you as Monkey, believe it or not, you've got some pretty key cooldowns too. So, a dive comp like Double Bubble, for example, with like Genji Tracer and Winston Zarya or whatever lineup you have during that, is a composition that isn't all dive. Typically, you'll even see like an anchor DPS like Ashe in that composition, or a soldier or something like that, and a backline like on a Brig. So it's not like all characters are just holding W, but it's understanding that you have the reach and the resources to do more than you can as solo Monkey. You've got the Zarya bubble, you've got the follow-up from Genji, meaning you've got a longer fuse, and you've got more burst potential. So understanding what parts of the rest of your composition enable different parts of your kit is really crucial to, playing main tank in general, but of course playing a dive and an engaged tank like Winston. So going in, you want to judge like, oh, can I kill this person? They're half HP, and I'm landing directly on them, and I'm isolating their healers. I can probably solo kill them. But if I'm jumping into Orisa, Sigma, Baptiste, Brig, whatever bullshit it is, you're probably not expecting to get any kills, but Genji might get a kill. Or the Zarya bubble might build enough energy so we don't even need to get a kill, but still come out at advantage. Things like that. There's other things we can play for outside of our own kit, but we still look a little similar. We just have different expectations about what's going to come out of that dive.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, awesome. Let's talk about some other heroes that we might play with that don't follow the same sort of script. So using cooldowns together, that's one thing. Understanding when Genji's in dash range, when Zarya has bubbles up, simple enough stuff, right?
Yeah.
We just have a mental timer going on and we see where our teammates are and what they're capable of. Let's say instead now we're playing with Diva, Pharah, and Tracer. A lot less cooldown reliant. Sure, Diva still has boosters like your jump. Tracer's still reliant on blinks as a cooldown, but for the most part, these heroes have a lot more general uptime and less all-in potential, right? So how might your playstyle change in those kind of situations? Do you have any ideas?
Um, I would probably want my uptime to be. I'd have more uptime, so I wouldn't be focusing on trying to wait for one coordinated attack with the Genji and the Doom for so, but probably trying to be more soft diving, just keeping the attention on me while they're also like harassing them. So it's like kind of like a poke, even though Winston's not a poke, but kind of like that in a way.
For sure. The biggest word I'm going to throw around here is called neutral. And I stole this from fighting games because I love fighting games. I'm terrible at them, but I love watching them.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
And awesome. So yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of neutral. But in this
Yeah.
kind of situation, the most important part you're basically playing footsies with your opponent at this point. You're trying to bait them into overexposing themselves before you even have to commit anything. So when you've got Tracer running around the map, when you've got Pharah launching in rockets, or maybe you've got like an Ashe in your backline too, like obviously you don't have the dive potential of Genji Doomfist, so you're not going to expect that burst blow up dive. But you can expect, hey, maybe we got a rocket directed into their backline and we forced their lamp out. Or maybe we like broke their shields really early and now they're playing split. Or maybe our Tracer's on payload and pushing the payload for free and now they're forced to rotate before we've even had to set up for a dive and things like that. There's other ways to play the game that don't rely solely on lining up that engage. You can play slower, you can play for more uptime like you said, but generally speaking, you don't want to force your cooldowns early. You don't want to force a jump unless you're already finding an advantage, either based on positions that your rest of your team is taking or based on some kind of poke damage in the pre-fight that you've set up. Either maybe it's just enough damage from Pharah that she builds barrage, then you can go all in. Then all of a sudden she has a priority cooldown. Stuff like that.
Yeah. I feel like I play that probably more like that play style than the early one anyways, like just getting up there, like poking them, building like ult, just trying to just kind of like tase them until finally we have something that like a nano, or we have the Pharah, some kind of big ult to be able to go in with. Okay.
You don't need to go in and run the show in that type of composition. You are trying to take the heat off your team as often as possible, but realistically you need to focus on yourself, focus on your individual value, whether that's taking position, whether that's pushing a payload, whether that's setting up soft dives and working through space slowly and stuff like that. But those harder dives will be fewer and farther between, and usually will come off the mistakes of the enemies more than the setup of your own team. So Genji, Doomfist, Winston, Zarya, all four of you can set up really aggressively and just go do whatever you want wherever and probably find a kill or two. With Tracer and Pharah, you need some sort of bonus value. You need something to distract them, like a payload. You need flank angles from your Tracer to be able to isolate people. You need damage from your Pharah before the dive starts to make sure you can actually find kills and things like that. So it's a much more patient game. And basically, to throw the word tempo in again, it's a slower tempo composition.
Yeah.
Because it's less reliant on priority cooldowns and it's more reliant on neutral value.
You're just waiting.
More reliant on your guns, basically.
Yeah. So it's creating versus capitalizing on like a mistake, waiting on an opportunity to come through.
Exactly.
Okay.
And let's say, God forbid, but I've seen ranked comps, I know what happens in there. Let's say we're playing Orisa, Winston, Bastion, Ashe, or Bastion, Hanzo backline, and you're just a solo Winston with no help in the world. I will say, you probably shouldn't play Winston in that type of comp, but if you were, just as an example, how do you think it might change your playstyle?
So we're running Orisa, Bastion, Ashe, and so...
Yeah, and Brig Bap, let's say.
I mean, I'd probably be like trying to just hit their back line and like diving and just being a menace, like flanking for the most part, because I'm kind of by myself. I don't need to take the space because Orisa's going to be doing that for me. And then just really harassing their back line for the most part.
A big part of here, again, similar to other engages, even compared to our dive engages, the big part is still timing and timing on when you're using your cooldowns. Even if no one else on your team has priority cooldowns to use, like, I mean, what cooldowns does Bastion even have, really? They're not thinking about using their cooldowns. They're not thinking about specific windows, but you still need to. So in that type of situation, it's usually going to be on how much pressure your team is getting just based on wherever they're sitting. If you've got a Bastion on payload and it's pushing up, eventually the enemy team's going to have to deal with that. If you've got a Bastion on defense, eventually the team's going to have to deal with that. So in those situations, you prioritize using your timing more around the enemy's timing. Because the enemy team composition, let's say for exaggeration purposes, they're playing dive against whatever cacophony of composition you guys are playing. they have a much higher tempo composition. I'm sure you'll agree. They have higher priority. They have more cooldowns to use. They have more burst potential. All these kind of things. So you usually want to mold yourself because you're the most flexible part of your entire team. Same if you were playing like a Tracer with that composition instead of an Ashe, for example, or a Hanzo.
Yeah.
You'd want to mold yourself to the enemy's tempo and look for more of those counter engages we talked about. Even without Primal, counter engage dives with your bubble are extremely potent for isolating people, blocking a lot of burst damage, and then helping your team clean up some kills once they engage into you.
Yeah.
Again, just like we were waiting for our aggressive cooldowns when we're trying to take high tempo plays with our Genji and our Doomfist, when we're playing slower tempo against a high tempo team comp, we want to wait for their cooldowns and look to punish them. Almost play like a bait and punish game. And again, since we have all the tools outside of yourself, we've got the Orisa, we've got the Bastion, forcing their hand, it's a lot easier to play for those things.
That makes sense because it makes so much sense now you brought up like the idea of attention that the tanks bring up, because now the attention's not really on me at that point, so I can just take my time, wait for it, and
you don't need to force anything
I can
because
start it whenever I want. Yeah.
Exactly. Everyone else on your team is already forcing so much priority. It's like they're thinking to themselves, "Oh my God, they got a Bastion behind an Orisa shield. We got to set something up," and then you're there just to foil their plans.
Exactly. Yeah. So like farmers, you can kind of think of it the same way when we're like our team's running a pocketed Pharah, and because we have Pharah.
Yeah, you don't need to force anything until either Pharah finds value. Maybe we force some disruption, or you work just a little bit slower. Like you're not looking for hard dives or stuff like that, but you can still look for soft dives. You can still take parts of the map solo and enable deeper aggression, but also making sure you're staying a little bit aware of their engage potential and whether or not they're going to engage into you.
Yeah. What about if we're running against like a mirror dive comp, so where you are trying to set up and create an opportunity, but then they create the opportunity first? Like, are we supposed to wait on them? Do we try to push the tempo first? Or do we try, like,
so
counter diving I'm not really too familiar with.
So all these comp matchups I've brought up, they've been a very clear comp differences, right? One team is very clearly faster than the other.
Yeah.
And that will happen often in ranked, often just because of different tanks that were chosen or different DPS that were chosen. Like if you're playing Winston D.Va with Tracer Genji and they're playing Winston D.Va with McCree Hanzo, you have the faster composition, right? Even with slightly mirrored tank line, at least, you can still see differences in those types of compositions. Yeah. In a ranked environment, even those slight differences get pretty muddied and they don't actually matter that much. So typically when measuring tempo against another team, measure yourself against the enemy tank line. Measure yourself, like if you're playing dive tanks and they're playing dive tanks, consider it a mirror. If you're playing dive tanks and they're playing Rein Zarya, you've got higher tempo. Or if they're playing Orisa, you've got higher tempo. If you're playing dive tanks, but they're playing like faster dive tanks, I don't know, they're playing like Ball Winston instead of Winston Zarya, then they have a slightly faster composition. Okay. In a mirror, tempo becomes a much harder thing to read. So there are little things like maybe a different DPS character or different ultimates available or priority positional advantage like defender's advantage versus attackers that might give you a tempo advantage just inherently. But for the most part, mirror matchups are all about not making the first mistake. So first things first, a lot of these first fights where it's like a true neutral, like first fight on Koth, for example, we're all rolling at the point. There's no ult charge. Everyone's full HP. We're all doing whatever we want to do. What's important there is just making sure you don't show your hand too early. And if you are committing, it's with the intention of catching them off guard, not with the intention of forcing a reaction.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? That sounded like a bit confusing in my head. So what I mean by that is, it's not enough to just go in and take attention in a mirror comp. Unless you have very explicit purpose for that. If you're playing like with Zarya, for example, and you're playing, okay, first fight, we're just going to play to get 80 charge, and then we'll go in. Sure, soft dive then, get bubbled, get some charge, use your bubble, get it alive.
Yeah.
As long as that's clear. But what you don't want to do is sort of like autopilot and think like, oh, okay, when I'm playing Winston, I usually just jump in early, get some charge, and then jump out. If you're not thinking about all the things you're playing for, all of a sudden your individual value gets lost in this type of mirror composition, and then little things get punished. Like you jumping out, all of a sudden, because their Winston didn't jump or bubble yet, he's chasing you down, and now maybe they can kill you without a bubble.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. But what about like the counter dive? So like say they jumped in first, like, because I mean I'm still like I'm like learning a bunch of different things, so trying to like find that mistake that they're making in it too. So like, I mean, is it if he's jumping out or jumping into our back line and it's out of LOS of his own team, it's like that's big
Yeah,
mistake,
he's feeding.
mistake. Yeah, but yeah, for sure. So like, what are some other things to look out for that are like basic fundamentals of the counter dive that are easy to exploit as well?
So counter aggression, I'll break it down into two sort of areas. There's team counter aggression, where you're playing for your team, and this is exactly like jumping behind a target, except the target's jumping behind you anyway, and all you have to do is turn around and bubble them, and they put themselves in that position to be isolated. Usually, people won't put themselves in that position for free. They'll be coordinating with other people. They'll be wanting you to think about them. For example, like you want, as Winston, for people to be thinking about you instead of your Genji or your Tracer or your Doomfist. So don't overcommit to that. Like, don't jump on the target if he's 5 feet in front of you. Maybe don't bubble if you don't see any follow-up damage coming from behind them if you don't need to, for example. But try and gauge the situation and then decide where you're needed most. And you just play for your team. You play to bubble priority damage more than heroes. So you don't want to throw a bubble just like on your Ana because she's there, because she's going to have to be moving all around the map during these engages. Bubble where the enemy threats are coming from, either priority damage, I mean, a picture like a Widowmaker across the map that you just block a sightline, or priority healing, same thing with like an Ana, for example.
Okay, that makes sense.
The other way of counter-aggressing is to look for trade dives. And for the most part, this needs to be something you have a very strong read on the fight on. So, just like we said, we can talk about like potential, but until they actually find the kills, till they actually mechanically perform, that potential isn't realized until the deaths start piling up, right?
Yeah.
So, if you can measure the enemy potential, like if there's a Winston jumping in solo, he's probably just gonna die, like you said. But if he's jumping in with Genji, Nano Blading, and the Tracer, and like Moira Lucio, actually, let's say not Moira Lucio because we're talking about trading. Let's say they're playing Brigana, and their Brigana's looking to walk in and anti-nade your whole team. In those kind of situations, you probably don't have what it takes to, maybe you don't have Primal, you don't have anything you can do to really stop a Nano Blade. So in those situations, your best time might be spent looking to disrupt their follow-up. And this is very similar to when we were talking about that aggro primal, where you're booping someone like a Reinin and then you go disrupt the backline. They're the ones bringing their front line to you, their engage potential to you, so you can just jump straight to that second part of that win condition and disrupt their follow-up.
Just undermine it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This is typically most well abused when you have a strong defending advantage. And that's going to either look like a strong high ground defensive position for your defenders. Like, for example, here, let me just load into a map, actually. We can look at it.
Okay.
I'm going to load us into Dorado. Very comfy Winston map.
Oh, yeah. One I need a lot of work on.
Awesome. And then I'll move us onto the same team here. So you go ahead and lock Winston. I'll be playing, let's say, an Ashe. Or a Hanzo, because I can wall climb with him.
Yeah.
So say we're on defense. Again, this trade dive potential thing is usually something you're going to focus on when you have defensive advantage. So the biggest form of defensive advantage, or at least the most common one, is positional advantage. If the doors are opening for the first time and you've got your backline up here, of course you can go a little bit aggressive and understand that we're safe even without you on top of us, right? They still have to commit cooldowns to get on top of us, and we can just sit here until they do, and then walk away if we're pressured, right? We have all of the map to play with. We have all the space. Our healers should be comfy. Our DPS should be comfy. You don't need to think about them because the map is already covering for them. In those situations, say, just like the same thing happened, like their Winston Diva jump up here, and their Brig Honor trying to round the corner, look for a nade and stuff like that. All you have to do in those moments to counter trade, you don't need to find 6 kills. You drop down here, you throw your bubble on the ground to stop any healing, and you bubble dance the Honor and the Brig away. All of a sudden, you're trading your value for all of their support line. Maybe they've even got like an Ashe or a McCree down here, or a Hanzo like me, and all of a sudden they can't follow up. Now that Winston and Diva and maybe even a DPS like a Tracer, sure, all 3 of them are coordinating, but now they're trying to take a 3v5 into your entire backline where they're on the high ground and their enemy team had to use cooldowns to even start the fight, right? Yeah. So your team has all these cards ready to play. The enemy team is already playing them. You have defender's advantage. You can abuse that as Winston.
Okay, yeah, because with Dorado on this point, I'm usually posted up here, and that would make sense. But usually with like there's a ball or a diva that goes and pushes the back line, I'm like the first thing I think of is to go jump after them. But really, my team should be safe. You're saying because it's going to take a lot to kill to get them, where I can just drop down here, bubble this, and just cut
obviously,
them off.
Your team, you're exactly right, should be safe. In a ranked environment, sometimes it doesn't always play out that way, but on paper at least they
you
should
find out
be
very
safe,
early
yes.
if they're not. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. And you can sort of gauge those situations too. Like I said, like if we're all playing up here and we've got Brig Ana and we've got our other off tank, maybe our D.Va like ready to peel for us here, you don't need to think about this at all. But in your average ranked game, that's not what happens. You've got an Ashe over there trying to shoot spawn. I'm over here as Hanzo. Our Ana's like throwing nades up into the sky trying to find lineups, and we're all split from each other. Maybe then, even though we should have defender's advantage, you can realize what's actually going on around it in your team that you might actually be forced back. Because instead of having a 3v5, maybe Winston is solo jumping your Ashe over there who's overextended without Coach Gun, and then maybe you do need to kite back and dive for her. It's easy to talk about what should happen on paper, but the reality, especially in a ranked environment, is you need to stay almost hyper aware of what could go wrong at any given moment. Always plan for the best, but reality dictates that we need to be ready for the worst.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I kind of relate it to like how Reinhardt gets played. If there's someone's flanking your team, like your job is to just cut off the rest of their team from being able to like, push with a Reaper that's shooting your back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Your team should be able to take care of them. If they can't, then you got to play differently. But the Winston's essentially doing kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, like, you can very easily relate this to your own play. Like, how hard is it to go in when your Ana's not healing you, when your Zarya wastes her bubble or misses your bubble on you or stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
It feels awful. So imagine how the enemy team is going to be like, oh, we got this huge plan come up. Ana, you're going to hit the fattest nade as soon as we dive. We're going to hit Nano, like all these things. And all of a sudden, oops, there's a bubble and everything falls to
wrong.
shit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay.
So yeah, it happens all the time, especially in ranked. If you start playing in scrims on a team and stuff like that, you can start thinking more higher level and with more trust for your teammates and start pushing these limits. But the reality is sometimes you need to be ready for the shit to hit the fan.
Yeah, for sure.
And then we're talking about too, the only other situation I'd want you thinking about these sort of defensive trade dives. And I mean, I struggle to even call them dives, but defensive like traded positioning. In this kind of situation, you're not really diving those people. You're just blocking their entrance and stuff like that.
Right.
But the only other time, sorry, I keep ranting. I keep going off on tangents.
No, you're good.
The only other time you should be thinking about this consistently is on 2CP defense on second point. Or on maps, even potentially like Dorado or Payload or hybrid maps with really strong third points for defenders, like your Eichenwalds, your Hollywoods, arguably your Nimbanis, your Dorados, and stuff like that, where third point, most maps, Payload maps, are extremely hard to cap as attackers and are extremely defender favored.
Yeah.
It almost plays like a second point 2CP. But the defensive advantage there isn't that you have strong positioning or high grounds or off angles or something like that. It's literally just your spawn is 2 seconds away and their spawn is 10 seconds away.
So much closer. Yeah, right.
That advantage alone means that as Winston, if you or you plus a diver or you with primal or whatever it is, if you trade value in the enemy backline and you find a kill, that's worth like 3 deaths for the most part. Don't quote me on that. That's not exact math, but that kill for you is so much more beneficial because of the spawn advantage.
Yeah. So in those type of fights where things are like, that's where I need to be going in to be able to stall. Is we just got to get at least one kill and try to get at least the key one for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Ideally, in those situations, you have people dedicated. You have people or a person dedicated to making sure the payload doesn't get capped if it's like 0.001 meters away. In order to actually try and win that fight, which I would argue you should try to win every fight, you should be looking to find a way back in, and the easiest way to swing things into your favor is, like you said, finding a kill. And because of the spawn advantage, it means like even a single kill, especially a high priority kill, like their main healer, like an Ana or a Baptiste, or their main tank, like a Winston or a Reinhardt, can just completely upset the balance of that team fight. Even if it was just like 1v6 the moment prior, and then you trade one out, and then 5 people are spawning into a 5v5, that's a much better ground for you to try and retake than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So did you have anything to add to that one? Because I did have another question, but it's related to something
no, I think I'm good.
different.
Go for it.
So off tank, how to play with different ones. Sigma, what's the most ideal way to play with him? If like
similar to Zarya, but without bubbles. So if Zarya is already high charge, how do you like to play? Generally speaking, like imagine Zarya didn't have bubble in her kit, but she's always at 100% charge. How would you play?
Oh, I would just press W or just get in their team and with the Zarya. Make sure Zarya's there, but she's going to be melting.
Exactly.
Everything.
You make sure Zarya's there. So you don't do things like jumping up to high grounds as aggressively. Sure, you can still soft dive, but be ready to fall back into your Zarya's range or into your Sigma's range. Very rarely will Sigma's resources be used for you. Sigma is also a very individual style tank where he can do a lot on his own, but that means his kit is generally for himself. He puts his shield up and then the next second he's taking it down because he wants to recharge it. He's using a shift primarily for himself, sometimes for the team, but primarily for himself. So biggest thing when it comes to timing yourself with that off tank is looking at their position, because they are waddling around on the ground like two slow little off tanks. You need to wait for them to be in position because, again, you're the most flexible member of that duo, so you need to play around them. You're only as fast as your slowest member.
Okay. So can I play
So if you want to aggress up here, that means having your Zarya or Sigma rotate maybe up here so they can push in with you and help support your aggression.
Yeah. So I mean, Winston's not a very good choke player, but could I play more into a choke? So like I can vault, for instance, if we're playing with Winston and on attack with Winston and Sigma, could I play through that choke or get up on the bridge above the choke and let the Sigma burst down, or not burst down, but just spam to get up there, just making sure he's with me? Or
I would say you don't necessarily need to, but even when so when I say like an aggressive movement, or like I typically refer to a dive on Winston, but an aggressive movement can just be taking space. So here, let's just go to Icon Wall. It'll be easier to visualize.
Okay, yeah.
Oops, I didn't need to leave game. I should have just reset. Icon Walled. Here, we'll go to the Halloween one. And you said we're playing Winston Sigma on attack here.
Yeah.
So, realistically, neither of these tanks are especially strong at breaking a choke.
Yeah.
That typically means you should be pairing them with a DPS line that also doesn't struggle to break a choke, like flankers, like long range hit scan, like maybe a Widow or a Hanzo or an Ashe, who can do stuff without having to cross the choke, or who can cross the choke very easily with blinks, with dashes, with Doomfist rollouts around the entire map or whatever like that.
Yeah, yeah.
For the most part, though, you and Sigma walking together doesn't really benefit anyone. Sigma just has another target behind his shield, but again, he's going to be shielding for himself more than anyone. So if he's walking through this choke, he's probably thinking, oh, I'm taking some shots, I put my shield up, and I'm trying to get here, then I take my shield down.
Cover. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you can walk around with him, same as like our backline will probably want to walk around with him for that additional safety that the shield provides, but you don't really get anything from that. You're not threatening from range here, obviously, as Winston, not until Overwatch 2 at least.
Yeah.
And you do have some ability to help you take space. So your first jump here might just be like from here into that mini room over there, or it might be up into these stairs to go up top right, like over there. And stuff like that. So you don't need to dive the backline because they're on point. You need to wait for your Sigma and the rest of your team, if you're playing a slower backline, if you're playing Ashe Hanzo or Widowmaker or on a Brig or stuff like that. Even if you want to go aggressive, there's no one else that can follow you up.
Yeah.
So making sure that you're, again, wait for them to rotate. And a good practice in these moments is, yes, you want to get in as early as possible and start setting up, but also being ready for that counter dive potential, because the rest of your team is so slow, the enemy team might find a reason to engage. So jumping is usually fine, especially if you're jumping early, like while your team's still walking through, and then you can just like walk back and bubble and stuff like that. But what you don't want to be doing is walking up to this choke, throwing your bubble down, and then telling your team to walk through. That is just a waste of resources. Sigma can do it because he can instantly drop it and start regenning it right away. That's not a big deal. But for you, it's a core part of your kit, and it's again, it's basically half your health bar when you use it. So understand that sometimes you will be required to do it. Like maybe you have to block a Roadhog hook last second or something like that. But understand how much that really inhibits your play. But yeah, for the most part, you don't need to play for Sigma's space. He doesn't need to play for your space. You guys can each independently work the map. I might recommend, if you are struggling to get in solo, you could try picking up a more independent hero like Wrecking Ball, for example. I don't know if you've played much Wrecking Ball, but plays a very similar role to Winston, just more solo Kiwi.
And he's got more uptime. Yeah, more solo Kiwi. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, we're focused on Winston for today, obviously, so don't need to go too deep into that.
Right. Yeah, it's covered a lot of different like areas. I was like, I'm not sure how to do this.
Yeah, like I said, I have no idea how to describe this session, but it usually, for 99% of my students, they always walk away happy, and it's a lot of important stuff to get out of the way before we just jump into a VOD review. Because otherwise, I'd be like trying to explain 10 different topics, and now I can just call back to everything we talked about today.
Yeah, then I have like at least some goals to go in with as specifically as Winston for like my next comp games. Okay, this is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I don't have any other material to really cover. If you have any more questions, more